I used to think I had it all figured out, or at least as much as anyone ever does. I had a husband I loved, 2 kids who made my heart melt in moments and drive me insane in equal measure, and a house in a sleepy suburb that I'd spent years turning into a home. On paper, life looked neat, organized, Instagram-worthy even. But the thing about appearances is that they're often just that, a polished front, hiding cracks that get deeper with every ignored complaint, every silent sigh, and every chore left half done. I remember waking up that morning with that nagging feeling in my chest, the one I'd learned to recognize over years of marriage. It's that slow, simmering frustration that starts in your stomach and spreads upward until it settles behind your eyes. A dull, persistent ache. Matt was still asleep, the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the room. I tried to let it go, tried to brush off the irritation, but even as I went about making breakfast, I felt it crawling under my skin. It wasn't like he was a bad husband. Matt was kind in ways that mattered. He made me laugh, held the kids when I needed a break, and never forgot my birthday or our anniversary. But there were these small things, tiny betrayals really, that piled up until the weight was unbearable. Laundry was one of them. It always was. I didn't even think about it when we got married. I assumed we'd figure it out, naturally fall into some sort of rhythm. But somehow, years in, I found myself trapped in this invisible contract. I would wash, fold, and put away all the clothes, while Matt's contribution stopped at maybe tossing his own socks into the hamper if I was lucky. That morning I had specifically asked him to put away the clean laundry. A simple request. Nothing dramatic, nothing unreasonable, but his response still burned in my mind, that casual, dismissive line. "They're your clothes." As if the t-shirts with cartoon superheroes on the front, the yoga pants I wore to the gym, the school uniforms I neatly folded each night, all somehow belonged to me exclusively. His crisp button-downs, his meticulously organized work shirts, were untouchable sacred artifacts that required no effort on his part. I remember standing there in the kitchen, my hand frozen mid-scramble of eggs, staring at him through the soft morning light, filtering through the blinds. He was scrolling through his phone, utterly oblivious to the storm raging in my chest. It was then that I realized something fundamental. I was tired. Tired of silently accepting the imbalance, tired of pretending it didn't matter, tired of letting resentment build until it festered into anger. That day, I decided, was going to be different. I walked into the laundry room and froze for a moment, surveying the battlefield. A basket of freshly washed clothes sat on the dryer, an innocent-looking pile that had over time become a symbol of everything I'd been bottling up. Mixed in the pile were my leggings, the kids' school uniforms, and proudly, arrogantly Matt's shirts. They were neatly folded like little white flags, signaling some unspoken rule that his chores were untouchable. I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled. A real wicked smile, the kind you only allow yourself when you're plotting a small but satisfying rebellion. I grabbed his shirts first, separating them carefully from the rest. I didn't rip or crumple them. He might have killed me if I had, but instead I moved them with deliberate slowness, as if each motion were a calculated statement. Then I stuffed them into a plastic bag and marched upstairs to our bedroom. Under the bed they went, out of sight, out of mind. It felt like hiding a secret treasure, only instead of gold or jewelry, it was his perfectly ironed, meticulously cared-for shirts. Returning to the laundry room, I picked up my clothes, and the kids folding them with the care I always did. It was soothing in a strange way, the rhythmic motion of straightening hems, aligning sleeves, tucking socks into matching pairs. But there was an edge now, a thrill. I was finally asserting control quietly, cleverly. I was going to teach him a lesson, but on my terms. As I worked, I reflected on our life together. Matt and I had met in college, 2 young, idealistic students at a local university. He had this easy charm that drew people in, and I, naive and ambitious, fell for it completely. Our early years were carefree, filled with late-night walks, pizza in our tiny apartment, and dreams that seemed as tangible as the skyline outside our window. Then came the first apartment we rented together, then the kids, then the mortgage. Life became a series of schedules, obligations and small compromises, and somewhere along the way I had compromised too much. I thought about my friends, single and free, occasionally posting snapshots of spontaneous weekends and carefree brunches, and yes, part of me envied them, not because I didn't love my life. I did, but because sometimes I felt invisible in it. I was Kelsey, mother, wife, caretaker, laundry folder, organizer of the domestic universe, while Matt floated somewhere in the periphery, blissfully unburdened by the small invisible weight of responsibility. I remembered a conversation from a few months back. We'd been arguing, not for the first time, about chores. He had said in that irritatingly calm way that somehow made me doubt my own frustration. "Why do you care so much? It's just laundry." And I had realized then that it wasn't about the laundry, it was about respect, about partnership, about being seen and acknowledged for the effort I put into our shared life. So that morning, folding my leggings and the kids' uniforms, I felt something shift. It wasn't just rebellion, it was a statement, a declaration that I mattered, that my contributions weren't invisible, and that my voice was finally going to be heard. By the time Matt walked through the door that evening, loosening his tie and muttering about a long day at work, I was calm, composed, and ready. Tea in hand, I watched him move through the living room, expecting a casual "hi honey" and a sigh of relief that everything was normal. Instead he froze, brow furrowed, as if he had suddenly realized something was off. "Hey Kels, where's my blue shirt?" he called from the bedroom, his voice tinged with confusion. I suppressed a smirk and repeated almost innocently his own words from that morning. "Oh, I only put away my clothes. Yours must still be in the laundry room." He frowned, shuffled downstairs, returned with the empty basket, and muttered something under his breath. I shrugged. "Guess you'll have to check again tomorrow," I said lightly, settling back into my tea. His puzzled stare didn't bother me. In fact, it energized me. This small act of defiance, petty as it may have seemed, felt like reclaiming a little piece of my life. By bedtime I reflected on the day's events, trying to temper the satisfaction with perspective. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a battlefield, and I didn't want it to become one. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like an equal in the room, a participant in the life we had built together, rather than a silent servant to it. And as I drifted off to sleep, the image of a plastic bag tucked under the bed, containing neatly folded shirts, that symbolized so much more than fabric, lingered in my mind. It was small, it was domestic, but it was mine and it felt revolutionary. The next morning I woke up with the familiar ache in my chest, the one that came when anticipation mingled with frustration. I had spent the night half sleeping, replaying every tiny detail of yesterday, wondering how long it would take Matt to notice, or more importantly, how long it would take him to understand. The sun spilled through the blinds, golden and lazy, and for a moment I wished I could ignore it, pretend the day wasn't waiting to demand my energy, but there was no escaping it. Laundry wasn't just laundry, it was a symbol of something far bigger, something I had ignored for too long. I peeked into the bedroom, expecting to see him casually rifling through the closet, muttering something about a missing tie or sock. Instead, the bed was empty, the morning silence heavy with unspoken tension. I made breakfast, pouring cereal into bowls for the kids, trying to appear as if nothing was different. But the truth was, the quiet in the house felt like the calm before a storm. My kids, blissfully unaware, chatted about school projects and playground antics, and I felt a pang of guilt for the petty war I was waging just a few feet away from them. By the time Matt appeared in the kitchen, his hair sticking up in all directions and a furrow etched between his brows, I knew the storm had arrived. He was already visibly flustered, the kind of disoriented panic that only comes when an adult realizes their carefully constructed world has tilted ever so slightly. "Kels, seriously, where are my shirts?" he demanded, voice tight with frustration. I leaned against the counter, spoon in hand, deliberately casual. "I told you, Matt," I said slowly, letting each word hang in the air. "If they're my clothes, then I'm only handling mine. You're an adult, figure it out." He froze, blinking as if the words hadn't fully landed. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, a fish gasping for water. I watched him take a deep breath, trying to summon a response, and I realized I was seeing something I hadn't expected: genuine vulnerability. "Matt, The man who usually navigated life with this effortless ease was unmoored, and part of me, a part I hadn't recognized until now, felt a flicker of power. The morning became a blur of him digging through drawers, tossing aside socks, ties and even old gym clothes, searching for some semblance of a clean outfit. The kids giggled at first, thinking it was a game, until their fathers muttered curses, and loud sighs filled the room. I caught myself smiling, a quiet guilty satisfaction curling in my chest, but I also felt a strange twinge of guilt. I wasn't proud of causing frustration, but I couldn't deny the lesson was necessary. It wasn't just about the laundry anymore, it was about the principle, the daily erosion of respect and partnership that I had endured in silence. Each missing shirt, each wrinkled polo, each frantic search was a mirror, reflecting years of small injustices I had tolerated. And now, finally, Matt was forced to see it. By midday he had resorted to wearing a wrinkled polo that hadn't seen daylight since college. I couldn't help but notice the way he moved, stiff and self-conscious, as if his pride had shrunk alongside his wardrobe. I carried on with my day, attending to the kids' needs, managing school runs, preparing lunch, and secretly glancing at him, noting every moment of mounting frustration. It was then that I remembered the first time I had felt truly invisible in our marriage. It was years ago, just after Lily was born, when the house was a whirlwind of bottles, diapers and sleepless nights. Matt had come home from work one evening, exhausted but cheerful, expecting dinner on the table and a smile. I was sitting on the couch feeding the baby, and when I mentioned needing help, he laughed lightly, brushing it off. "You've got this, Kels. Don't worry about." And I had believed him. I had believed that my role was to endure, to manage, to silently hold the household together while he moved through life unencumbered. That memory hit me with a clarity that was almost painful. I had tolerated so much because I had assumed it was temporary, that life would eventually balance itself out, but it hadn't. The imbalance had solidified, codified into unspoken rules, and now, after years of passive acceptance, I was finally breaking. The breaking point, though, wasn't just about years of unnoticed labor, it was about the moment Matt had said it, casually, dismissively, as if the labor itself had no weight. "They're your clothes." Those words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling in a cathedral, reverberating through every memory of resentment, exhaustion and quiet sacrifice. I realized then that small acts of defiance, the kind I had toyed with in my mind countless times, could actually matter. They could shift the balance, force recognition, and demand acknowledgement. Over the next 3 days, I maintained my quiet rebellion. Each morning, I folded my clothes, and the kids, leaving his meticulously cared-for shirts in the bag under the bed. I watched him struggle, watched his frustration build, and felt a complicated swirl of emotions, guilt, satisfaction, empowerment, and a deep-seated hope that this would finally make him see. He came to me on the 4th day, slumped on the couch, defeated, the lines of exhaustion etched deeper than ever. "Okay, Kels, I get it," he said, voice low, tinged with both resignation and apology. "I was a jerk about the laundry. Can you please tell me where my shirts are?" I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "Laundry's not just my job, Matt. We're a team, and that means splitting the work. You don't get to cherry-pick your chores and leave me the rest." I let the weight of my words settle between us, the silence heavy with realization. "Your shirts are under the bed, go get 'em." He froze, eyes widening, a flicker of surprise, maybe even admiration, passing across his face. Then with a slow nod he retrieved the bag without a word. I watched him, a mixture of satisfaction and relief coursing through me, as he finally understood, not just where the shirts were but what they represented. That evening, something remarkable happened. Matt folded the entire load of laundry, his, mine and the kids, and even put it away. I watched him work, feeling a swell of pride mixed with an almost childlike delight. It wasn't just about the clothes, it was about recognition, respect and finally balance. By the end of the day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The lesson had been small, domestic, even petty by some measures, but it had worked. Matt would never again casually say, "They're your clothes," and the laundry basket, that mundane symbol of daily life, had become a shared responsibility, a tangible marker of partnership and equality. I reflected on the incident that night, curled up in bed with the kids asleep and the house finally quiet. I realized that the breaking point wasn't the theft or the hiding of shirts.
It was the cumulative weight of years of imbalance, unnoticed labor, and unspoken resentment. The shirts were just the catalyst, the spark that ignited change, and as I drifted into sleep, I felt a quiet sense of triumph, not because I had embarrassed my husband or won some small victory, but because I had reclaimed a piece of myself, demanded recognition in a subtle but undeniable way, reminded the people I loved that partnership required effort from everyone, every day. After those first few days of tension and revelation, life settled into a kind of quiet that was at once comforting and disorienting. The laundry incident had done more than just make Matt fold his shirts. It had forced us both to confront a truth I'd known for years, but had buried under routines and polite smiles. Marriage wasn't always fair, and equality didn't happen by accident. It had to be demanded, negotiated, and sometimes cleverly enforced. That first morning after Matt had retrieved his shirts, I noticed a subtle shift in him. He moved differently, not in a way that screamed guilt, but in a way that suggested he was weighing each action, considering his part in the balance of our home. He folded towels, organized the pantry, even reminded the kids to put their shoes away. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and I caught myself studying him, fascinated, a little amused and slightly wary. Change in a person, I realized, was never instantaneous or perfect. It was a slow, cautious crawl. The fallout, though, wasn't limited to household chores. It seeped into every corner of my day. Suddenly, I was hyper-aware of all the invisible labor I had been carrying, packing lunches, managing schedules, coordinating after-school activities, and keeping track of everyone's appointment. For years, I had performed these tasks, almost reflexively, like a machine operating in the background of our lives. But now, every plate I washed, every shirt I folded, felt like a conscious choice, rather than a mindless obligation. It was empowering, yes, but also exhausting. Recognition came with responsibility and scrutiny. Matt's reactions were the most revealing. At first, he overcompensated, trying to prove that he had understood the lesson. He scrubbed the bathroom tiles with an intensity I'd never seen before, organized the kids' school supplies, and even offered to cook dinner, a rare occurrence in our household. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and amusement. Watching him grapple with the reality of partnership was like witnessing a clumsy dance, awkward, sincere, and slightly endearing. But it wasn't just about the chores. The incident had cracked open a door I hadn't realized I was holding closed for so long. I began to notice my own patterns, my own compromises, and the ways I had quietly allowed my needs to take a back seat. I remembered the nights I had stayed up folding laundry while Matt played video games in the living room, or the mornings I had rushed through breakfast to ensure the kids were ready while he lingered, sipping coffee and scrolling his phone. For years, I had rationalized these sacrifices as part of the role of a wife and mother, but now, confronted with the imbalance head-on, I realized they weren't just sacrifices. They were. I started keeping a mental tally, not in a petty, judgmental way, but as a means of understanding myself and our dynamic better. I noticed the relief I felt when Matt genuinely contributed, the subtle shift in my stress levels, the sense of shared responsibility that had previously been absent. It was illuminating, like seeing a landscape in color after years of grayscale. Of course, change wasn't linear. There were moments when the old rhythms crept back in, subtle reminders of the imbalance that had defined our marriage for so long. One afternoon, I came home to find a pile of unfolded laundry, some of it Matt's, some the kids'. He had started the process but abandoned it midway, leaving a chaotic heap on the couch. My initial reaction was frustration, a flash of the old resentment, but then I paused. This was part of the process. Change didn't happen overnight, and expecting perfection was unreasonable. Instead, I took a deep breath, folded the clothes I could, and left the rest for him, silently affirming that this was a shared responsibility, not a battle. The children, of course, were oblivious to the subtle domestic revolution unfolding around them, but they did notice the tension had eased. Breakfasts became calmer, mornings smoother, and the occasional small fight over toys or school supplies felt less like a reflection of our household's dysfunction, and more like normal childhood chaos. It was a relief to see that the ripple effect of one small act of assertion could influence the atmosphere of our home in ways I hadn't anticipated. Work, too, was affected. I realized that my stress levels had a direct impact on my productivity and mood at the office. The quiet simmer of resentment that had followed me like a shadow was now lifting, leaving me clearer, more focused and more capable of handling challenges. without snapping at colleagues or second-guessing my own abilities. I had underestimated how much the domestic imbalance had weighed on me, and now that it was shifting, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't anticipated. Yet despite these positive changes, there were still emotional undercurrents that needed addressing. I found myself reflecting on the years I had tolerated the imbalance, and questioning why I had allowed it to persist. There were moments of bitterness, recollections of times when I had silently seethed while Matt moved through life with ease, and I recognized that these feelings were valid. I allowed myself to sit with them, journal about them, and even discuss them with a close friend. Articulating the frustration, rather than letting it fester silently, became a form of catharsis, a way to process the subtle emotional labor that had long gone recognized. The pivotal moment came one evening, when Matt and I were putting the kids to bed. He hesitated, then almost awkwardly said, "I know I was a jerk about the laundry, Kels. I didn't realize how much you were doing. I want to do better." It wasn't a grand gesture or an over-the-top apology. It was quiet, genuine, and unpolished. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, and I felt a warmth that had been missing for years. It was the first time in a long while that I truly felt seen and acknowledged, not just for the laundry, but for all the invisible labor I carried every day. That night I lay in bed thinking about what had changed. It wasn't the shirts themselves, or the small act of hiding. It was the conversation that unfolded, the realization that partnership required effort, awareness, and sometimes a little creative persuasion. I understood that balance in marriage wasn't something that could be assumed. It had to be actively cultivated, nurtured, and defended. The fallout was more than just Matt folding his shirts. It was a subtle but powerful shift in our household dynamic, a recalibration that made me feel lighter, stronger, and more confident. I realized that asserting boundaries wasn't an act of defiance against love. It was an affirmation of, by demanding recognition for the labor I contributed, I had created space for mutual respect, understanding, and shared responsibility. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, days when the old habits crept back in, and I had to remind myself that progress was a process, not a single event. But the lesson had been learned, and the ripple effects were undeniable. Even the kids, in their small, perceptive ways, began to notice the change. They saw their father folding clothes alongside me, taking initiative, and sharing responsibility. And though they didn't understand the full scope of the lesson, I knew that these small domestic revolutions were teaching them about fairness, respect, and collaboration in ways I hadn't anticipated. In retrospect, I understood that the fallout wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about recalibration. It was about realigning the scales, recognizing the invisible labor that had long gone unnoticed, and creating a household where everyone contributed. It was messy, imperfect, and sometimes uncomfortable, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt that the life I had built, our life, was truly shared, not just in responsibility but in recognition, respect, and mutual effort.
After the initial storm of the laundry incident passed, I realized that small victories, while satisfying, were only the beginning. Change in a marriage or any long-term relationship wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a series of tiny shifts that added up over months, years, and decades. I started paying closer attention to the subtle dynamics of our household, noticing patterns I had ignored, and in turn, finding opportunities to reclaim a sense of balance that went far beyond shirts, socks, or folded towels. It began with observation. I started tracking not out of pettiness, but as a way to understand how energy flowed in our home. How often did Matt take initiative without prompting? How often did I find myself quietly handling responsibilities he could just as easily take on? Writing it down, mentally, and sometimes physically in a journal, gave me clarity. I realized that the laundry incident had been a catalyst, a spark, but the real work was in the sustained effort to maintain equality. I remember one evening, while putting the kids to bed, I caught Matt lingering in the doorway of Lily's room, unsure whether to step in or retreat. I recognized that hesitation from myself. It was that awkward, tentative step when trying something unfamiliar. So I invited him in, calmly, guiding him through bedtime routines, offering small reassurances instead of criticism. Watching him read a story with exaggerated voices, mispronouncing some of the words, and Lily giggling uncontrollably, I felt a surge of something like pride. It wasn't just about him learning to help, it was about us functioning as a team. Encouraged by small successes, I began applying the same principle to other areas of our lives. Meals, once my sole responsibility, started to become collaborative. I began leaving small prompts, subtle nudges, and open-ended questions that allowed Matt to take initiative, rather than imposing directives. For example, instead of announcing dinner plans, I would ask, "What do you think we should cook tonight?" Sometimes he followed through, sometimes he didn't. And that was okay. It was progress, not perfection. I also found myself examining my own reactions. For so long, I had equated taking on all responsibilities with love and care. Now I realized that loving someone didn't require self-erasure. It required boundaries, self-respect, and a willingness to demand fairness even when it was uncomfortable. It was hard at first. I caught myself second-guessing, wondering if I was being petty, or too harsh, or unfair. But then I reminded myself of the years of silent frustration, the countless small injustices I had endured without protest. This was not about revenge, it was about restoration. One afternoon, I decided to escalate the stakes, slightly, not in a dramatic or punitive way, but to test the waters of accountability. Matt had left his coffee mug in the sink for the third time that week. Usually I would have cleaned it without comment, but this time I left it there. I made no remark, simply going about my tasks, letting the small act speak for itself. Later that evening, Matt noticed, paused, and washed the mug himself. It was a minor victory, but it carried a lesson. Awareness and responsibility were contagious. I also started to reflect on the underlying emotions that had fueled my actions. Frustration, resentment, and anger had all played a role, yes, but there was something deeper, an unarticulated desire for recognition, respect, and partnership. I realized that asserting boundaries and expecting shared responsibility wasn't selfish. It was a form of self-preservation and self-respect. The laundry incident had merely been the most visible symbol of a lifetime of invisible labor, but its lessons applied universally. My time, effort, and emotional energy mattered, and I had the right to protect them. Matt, for his part, began to show a remarkable capacity for growth. I noticed subtle changes. He asked about my day more, offered help without prompting, and even started anticipating needs. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a list he had made of household tasks, including some I hadn't even mentioned. It was both humbling and validating. I realized that people could change, but only when given both the opportunity and the gentle nudge to reflect on their behavior. The emotional transformation wasn't limited to him, either. I found myself more confident, assertive, and present. The constant background hum of frustration that had plagued me for years began to fade. I laughed more freely, engaged with my children more mindfully, and approached challenges with a sense of clarity that had been absent before. I even started looking at long-forgotten personal goals, things I had shelved because I felt perpetually occupied with the demands of family life. The household, surprisingly, continued to function. The world didn't collapse because I took up space for myself, but the process was not without conflict. There were moments when Matt faltered, reverting to old habits, or when I misjudged my approach and overstepped. I learned to navigate these moments with patience, conversation, and sometimes quiet persistence. I realized that sustaining change required empathy, flexibility, and a willingness to forgive, not forgetting the past, but acknowledging it and moving forward. By the time a few months had passed, the household rhythm had shifted dramatically. Laundry was truly shared, from sorting and washing to folding and putting away. Meals became collaborative, and small tasks, once sources of tension, became opportunities for teamwork. And beyond the chores, a deeper, more meaningful shift had occurred. Mutual respect. The silent acknowledgement that we were partners, not adversaries, infused our interactions. One particular evening stands out. I had spent the afternoon organizing the kids' craft supplies, a chaotic mix of glue sticks, markers, and glitter that had taken over the dining room table. Matt had joined me willingly, sorting materials, labeling containers, and joking with the kids in a way that made them laugh uncontrollably. I watched him, noting the care and attention he put into the task, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the help itself, but for the recognition
the shared effort, and the unspoken understanding that we were in this together. I also began to notice the ways this transformation rippled outward. My children saw partnership modeled in front of them, learning that fairness, respect, and shared responsibility weren't just abstract concepts, but lived experiences. Our friends commented on the change, noting the calmer, more harmonious energy in our home. Even Matt himself seemed to carry a subtle pride, as if understanding that growth, both his and mine, was an achievement worth acknowledging. By taking deliberate action, asserting my boundaries, and expecting accountability, I had turned the tables not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I had reclaimed my voice, my agency, and my sense of self within the family unit. The small domestic rebellion with the shirts had grown into a broader assertion of fairness and partnership that permeated every corner of our lives. And through it all, I discovered a profound truth. Real change, the kind that sticks, comes not from anger or punishment, but from awareness, persistence, and the quiet courage to demand equality. It's messy, imperfect, and sometimes uncomfortable, but it is transformative. And in reclaiming balance in my home, I had also reclaimed balance in myself. The weeks that followed felt almost surreal. The tension that had long lurked beneath the surface of our home had lifted, replaced by a quiet, almost fragile sense of equilibrium. I could feel it in the way Matt moved through the house, in the ease with which he picked up after the kids, in the way he folded clothes without a single complaint. But it wasn't just about chores anymore, it was about the shift in the way we saw each other, the acknowledgement of effort, and the understanding that partnership wasn't optional. I remember one Saturday morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, the kids laughing over a pile of crayons and sketchbooks sprawled across the living room floor. Matt was in the kitchen, humming softly as he brewed coffee, his movements deliberate yet relaxed. I watched him from the couch, a cup of tea in my hands, and realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of invisible labor pressing down on me. The house was alive, not because of my constant vigilance, but because we were all contributing, all participating. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but its impact was profound. I noticed the little things first. Matt reminding the kids to pack their homework without being prompted, folding laundry in the evenings without me saying a word, helping to tidy the living room after me. The mundane tasks that had once felt like chains, now felt like shared rituals, small acts of collaboration that reinforced a sense of belonging and respect. The kids, in their own innocent ways, reflected the shift too. Lily, who had a habit of leaving toys scattered across the living room, began to pick up after herself without constant reminders. Her younger brother, Ben, started helping with small chores, like putting dirty clothes in the hamper or setting the table for dinner. They didn't fully understand the reasons behind these changes, but they felt the stability, the fairness, and responded to it naturally. It was a small ripple effect, a lesson in partnership that began at home. For me, the transformation went deeper than chores and schedules. I felt lighter, freer, and more confident in asserting my needs and boundaries, not out of defiance, but out of necessity and self-respect. I could express frustration without fear of dismissal, request help without guilt, and take time for myself without feeling selfish. I even revisited personal goals I had sidelined for years, reading books, pursuing small creative projects, and carving out quiet moments for reflection. The liberation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. One evening, Matt and I sat on the couch after the kids had gone to bed. He leaned back, a subtle tension in his shoulders replaced by a relaxed openness, and said, "Kels, I know I don't always see it, but I really appreciate everything you do. I'm trying to be better, and I want to keep doing better." His words were quiet, unpolished, but they carried weight, the weight of recognition, understanding, and a willingness to change. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had been missing for years. "I know, Matt," I said softly, "and I see. That's all I ever wanted, to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to share the load." It wasn't about winning or losing, about proving a point or exacting revenge. It was about balance, partnership, and the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming agency in my own life. The laundry basket, once a symbol of imbalance and frustration, had become a shared responsibility. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't monumental, but it was emblematic of the larger changes we had made. Every folded shirt, every neatly paired sock, every basket put away without complaint, represented a deeper understanding of equality and mutual respect. I also began to reflect on the lessons I had learned about human nature, relationships, and resilience. Change often requires discomfort, the willingness to confront ingrained patterns, and the courage to assert boundaries. Small acts, seemingly insignificant, can catalyze profound shifts in dynamics, if approached thoughtfully and persistently. And sometimes the smallest gestures, a hidden bag of shirts, a quiet refusal to do it all alone, can ignite transformation. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still moments of tension, minor disagreements, and occasional lapses in responsibility. But now they were navigated with communication, understanding, and a shared commitment to fairness. The household felt like a living organism, each member contributing, supporting, and participating in a delicate, evolving balance. I looked at our family and realized that the true victory wasn't about laundry or chores. It was about respect, partnership, and emotional recognition. It was about teaching my children, and reminding myself that fairness matters, that boundaries are healthy, and that collaboration is the foundation of any lasting relation. As I tucked the kids into bed that night, I lingered in the doorway, observing their peaceful faces, and the small traces of daily life that reflected harmony rather than chaos. I felt a quiet pride, not in my cleverness or the lesson I had taught Matt, but in the way our family had adapted, grown, and learned to honor each other's contribution. Later, as Matt and I sat together in the living room, folding the remaining laundry in comfortable silence, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was our life, imperfect but real, messy but functional, and most importantly, I realized that the greatest lessons often come not from dramatic confrontations or grand gestures, but from the subtle assertion of self, the quiet demand for respect, and the patience to cultivate change over time. By the time I went to bed that night, the house finally quiet and the laundry neatly put away, I understood that balance wasn't just about chores, it was about emotional labor, acknowledgement, and partnership. And in reclaiming my voice, my agency, and my presence in our household, I had transformed not just the laundry routine, but the fabric of our family life itself. I smiled, thinking back to that plastic bag under the bed, the small rebellion that had sparked this cascade of change. It seemed almost absurd now, that a bag of neatly folded shirts could hold so much power, but it had. It had reminded us all, Matt, the kids, and me, that fairness, respect, and partnership weren't optional, they were essential. And in that quiet domestic triumph, I found not just balance, but peace.